this video, I'm going to be telling you about some super secret things for every single sword in Blox Fruits. Okay, so the very first sword that we got on this list is called the Katana, and I'm sure most of you watching should already know about this sword. It's a basic beginner sword that everyone should get when they enter the game. It costs a total of 1,000 belly, and obviously it's a common sword, and you can buy from an NPC called the Sword Dealer at the Pirate Starter Island and the Marine Starter Island. If you want to upgrade this sword to its next level, you have to pay a total of 5 leather and 5 angel wings, and this increases its damage by 30%. This sword has two abilities. The X ability is called Quiet Rush, and this is an ability where the user kind of dashes forward, dealing a bunch of strikes to the enemy, locking in place and preventing them from moving. And this ability has a 1 master requirement, so you basically get it as soon as you get the sword. Next ability is called Air Slash, and this also does exactly what it sounds like. You just shoot out a huge air slash and it deals a bunch of damage when it hits the enemy. Overall, this sword is a really good option for beginners. It has low cooldowns, low price, low master requirements, and it's particularly useful for people who don't have a fruit, aka players that are starting off. Alright, the next sword we got on the list is called the Cutless, and this is very similar to the Katana. I think it's just a reskin of it. This is also a common sword. It costs the exact same amount, which is 1,000 belly, and you also buy it from the exact same NPC, the Sword Dealer. And this also has a V2, which you can upgrade to by getting 5 leather and 5 angel wings, and it increases its damage by 30%. The Cutless's abilities are exactly the same as the Katana. You have the Quiet Rush ability with the 1 master requirement, and you have an Air Slash ability with a 20 master requirement. Overall, it's basically the same thing. It's good for starters, low cooldowns, low price, very low master requirements, but overall it's a pretty newbie sword, and you want to switch to a different one as soon as possible. Alright, moving on, next up we got the Dual Katana, and this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a katana, but instead of just having 1 katana, you have 2 of them. This is also a common sword, and you can buy it for a total of 12,000 belly. And the NPC you buy it from is called the Sword Dealer of the West, who's located at the Pirate Village in the First Sea. This sword also does have a V2, and to upgrade it to that, you can talk to the blacksmith, and you need to pay him 10 leather and 12 angel wings, and this increases its damage by 30%. This sword also has 2 abilities. First up, we got the Z ability. This one also has a 1 master requirement, just like the previous 2, and this ability is called Whirlwind. What this ability does is unleash a medium long range cone shaped attack that does a bunch of knockback to whatever you hit it with. Next ability has a 30 master requirement, and this one is called Tornado, and it does exactly what it sounds like. It spawns in a pretty small tornado and does a bunch of damage to anyone that gets caught in it. Overall, the sword is an excellent choice for beginners. It has pretty low master requirements, and its Z ability does area of damage, so that makes it pretty good for grinding. But the sword does not break observation, and it has average damage output. Overall, a really good sword to start off with, but switch to a different one as soon as you can. Alrighty, next sword we got on the list is called the Iron Mace. This is an uncommon sword, and you can also buy this from the Sword Dealer of the West, who's also located on the Pirate Village in the First Sea. This Iron Mace costs a total of 25,000 belly to buy, and it's also a pretty good starter sword. This also does have a V2, which you can upgrade to for 10 leather and 12 angel wings, and increases its damage by 30%. You have 2 different moves for this. First up is the Z ability, and this one also has a 1 master requirement, and it's called Mace Smash, and it does exactly what it sounds like. You just smash your Iron Mace into the floor, doing a bunch of AoE damage to anything in front of you, and this move in my opinion is pretty good for grinding. Next up is the X ability. This one has a 30 master requirement, and it's called Killer Combo, and it's kind of similar to the Air Slash of the Katana, but instead of just doing 1 slash, you do a bunch of slashes, and they deal a little bit more damage than the normal ones, making this pretty good for fighting enemies one-on-one. This sword is a good option for beginners. It's ideal for grinding at low levels. It has very low master requirements, but the bad thing though is that this sword is only really good for close range combat because all of its skills don't actually go long range or medium range either, and also it does have pretty low damage compared to other swords on this list. But overall, a pretty solid sword if you're starting off. Next sword we got on this list is called the Shark Saw, and this is an uncommon sword, and you actually don't really buy this sword from anyone. You get it from an NPC called the Saw, and the only way to get it is by killing him, and the Saw has a 10% chance of dropping this sword. This also does have a V2, which you can upgrade to for 10 leather, and increases the damage by 25%. This Shark Sword has 2 different abilities. The first ability is the Z ability. This one has a 1 master requirement, and it's called Consecutive Slashes, and it does exactly what it sounds like. It just spams a bunch of air slashes, locking the enemy in place and doing a butt ton of damage. Next ability is the X ability, and this one is called Execution. It has a 60 master requirement, and for this one you kind of just spin around, dealing a bunch of damage to everything around you. Overall, this is a good sword for early game farming. It has pretty low master requirements, and all of its moves have a stun effect, but just like the previous one, it has pretty limited range, and I don't really recommend farming the Saw just to get this sword because there's many better swords on this list that you can just save up belly and buy. Overall, a pretty mid sword because you need to kill a boss with a 10% chance of getting it. Next sword, or should I say swords, that we got on the list is the Triple Katana, and this is not 1, not 2, but 3 different katanas as one weapon. And this is an uncommon sword, and you can buy from an NPC called the Sword Dealer of the East, and you have to pay 60,000 belly for it. This sword also has a V2, which you can pay the blacksmith 15 metal scraps along with 15 leather, and increases its damage by 25%. It has 2 different abilities. First up, with the Z ability, it's called Air Slash's Barrage, and it has a 20 master requirement. And this is just like the Air Slash ability from the first katana, but instead of shooting off just one air slash, it does 3 different ones, making it do 3 times the damage of the katana. Next ability is called Violent Rush, and this is the X ability of the sword with a 60 master requirement. The user lifts all their swords up, dashing forward, leaving a trail of green colored slashes behind them, and does damage to any enemy standing in your way. Good things about this sword is that it's affordable, it's pretty beginner friendly, so you can learn it pretty fast, and it has low master requirements for the first seed. But the downsides to it is that it has pretty short range moves, and the Violet Slash ability has a bit of end lag, not really making it suitable for PvP. And it's really not optimal for grinding either, but overall it's still a pretty decent sword. Next up, we don't really have a sword, it's just called the Pipe. And this is a rare sword, and you can buy it from an NPC called the Sword Dealer of the East, who's located at the Frozen Village in the first sea. This sword costs a total of 100,000 belly. And it does have a V2, which you can upgrade to by talking to the blacksmith and giving him 12 fishtails along with 10 metal scraps, and increases the damage by 25%. Has 2 different abilities, starting off with the Z ability with a 1 mastery requirement, so you don't even need to grind for this ability. It's called Rage Combo, and it does exactly what it sounds like. You just dash towards your enemy in a fit of rage, and you deal a butt ton of damage to them by swinging your pipe. Next ability is the X ability, and this one is called Earth Smash. It has a 50 master requirement, and you just slam your sword into the ground, and it just raises a bunch of rocks, and it deals damage to any enemy that's on those rocks. And not to mention, also sends them flying into the sky, and they have no time to react to this ability. It's super fast. Overall, this sword is pretty good because it does decent damage, it's good at PvP, and it has low master requirements. And it also has a fast mobility move, making it pretty hard to dodge. But it does not break observation, and does not slow down melee attacks. But overall, I would still say it's a pretty decent sword, or should I say pipe. Next sword we got on the list is the Warden sword, and this is a rare sword, and you can get it from an NPC called the Chief Warden. And no, you don't buy it, you have to kill the NPC, and you have a 5 to 10% chance of getting it dropped. This sword has a V2, which you can upgrade to for 12 magma rocks and 10 leather, and it increases the sword's damage by 25%. This sword has 2 different abilities, and first up we got the Z ability. It's called Multi-Target Slash. It has a 35 master requirement, and you basically just slam your sword into the floor, dealing damage to everything that's around you. Literally a circle of damage. Next ability is called Tornado Slash, and this one has an 80 master requirement. You gotta just shoot a tornado flying towards where your cursor is, and it sends the enemy flying into the sky and deals a butt ton of damage to them. This sword is really good for beginners because it has a low master requirement, its moves are really fast, and all of its abilities do AoE damage, which makes it pretty good for grinding. But overall, I don't really recommend the sword for bounty hunting just because of the way it works, and it's pretty bad for PvP because it has pretty short range and low damage. Overall, still a solid sword, but I don't recommend grinding the Warden just to get this. Next sword we got on the list is called the Dual-Headed Blade, and this is the first rare sword that we got on the list, and you can buy this from the Master Sword Dealer, who's located at the 4th island of Skylands in the first sea. This sword costs a total of 400,000 belly. Damn, that's pretty expensive for the first sea. And it also does have a V2, which you can upgrade by talking to the blacksmith by giving him 12 fishtails and 10 metal scraps, and increases the sword's damage by 25%. Has 2 abilities, but starting off with the Z ability, which has a 20 master requirement. It's called Assassinate, and basically what you do is you just dash into a user, dealing a bunch of damage and a butt ton of sword strikes to them. Overall, pretty solid ability. Next ability is the X ability, and this is called Raging Wind with a 100 master requirement. And I kid you not, when you use this skill, you literally shoot out 3 miniature tornadoes who just drag your enemy back and deal a butt ton of damage to them. Overall, this sword has decent damage, it doesn't have any end lag on any of its abilities, and no dash on its melee attacks, and also has pretty low master requirements. But the bad things are that it has no stun moves, it's bad in the air, and it's pretty bad for later seas, but that's most of the swords in the first sea, so I would say this is overall a pretty decent sword. Next sword we got on the list, and one of my personal favorites, the Soul Cane. This is a rare sword, and you can get it from the Magma Island by talking to the Living Skeleton NPC, and it costs a total of 750,000 belly. And the way you get it is actually pretty cool. You have to walk through a secret wall on the volcano, and that's where you find the NPC. It also does have a V2, and you get it by paying the blacksmith 5 radioactive rocks along with 20 leather, and increases the sword's damage by 20%. It has 2 different abilities, starting off with the Z ability. It's called Soul Beam with a 40 master requirement, and this one is really cool. You kind of just shoot a beam, dealing a bunch of AoE damage to everything in front of you. And not to mention, it also looks pretty badass. Next ability is the X ability, and this one is called Soul Slashes, and it's very similar to the Katana's air slash ability. But instead of just shooting one air slash, you shoot a butt ton of them, dealing a bunch of damage to everything in front of you. Overall, the sword has very high combo potential because both its abilities lock the user in place when it's doing damage, and it's good for farming since both moves have the AoE damage and no knockback. And the moves are also extremely fast. Overall, it has pretty low damage compared to other swords, swords, and it also has a small hitbox and short range. So to use this sword properly, your enemies need to be right in front of you and you need really good aim. But if you have that, then it shouldn't be a problem. You can destroy your enemies with this. Alrighty, next sword that we got on the list is the Bento, and this is the first legendary sword on this list. It costs a total of 1 million belly, and you can buy from an NPC called the Master Sword Dealer. And it has pretty weird requirements. You have to be at least level 250 to buy it. The sword also does have a V2, which you can upgrade to for 15 metal scraps, 12 angel wings, and 10 magma ore. And this increases the sword's damage by 25%. This sword actually has 2 different versions, and to get the version 2, you just have to do a pretty long quest, but I'll be telling you guys about both the version's abilities. For version 1, the Z ability, it has a 50 mastery requirement. It's called Windbreaker, and for this one you just shoot out a bunch of air slashes to everything in front of you, and this has pretty medium range along with the area it covers, so it's pretty hard to miss your targets with this one. Next ability is the X ability, and this one is called Quake Spear, and for this one it basically just creates a huge spear where your cursor is and deals a bunch of damage to everything standing in that area. Alright, moving on to the V2 for this weapon. The first ability, Windbreaker, actually changes from just doing a bunch of sword slashes to dishing out an air ability and dealing way more damage. And the Quake Spear ability actually upgrades into a way bigger ball and deals way more damage on impact, making the sword way better. And obviously the V2 is better. I mean, it's literally called the V2 for a reason. Overall, this sword is pretty good. It has high damage and probably one of the best swords in the whole first sea. Next sword we got on the list is called the Trident. This is a rare sword, and once again, this is a sword that you cannot buy. You have to get it by defeating an NPC called the Fishman Lord, who spawns at the underwater city. And your drop chance for this sword is only 10%, so you're gonna have to kill him around 10 times to get this. The sword has a V2, and you can upgrade to it for 20 metal scraps along with 12 magma ore, and increases its damage by 25%. First ability from this sword is called Trident Throw, and it actually has 2 different functions. If you throw the Trident at a player, then it pulls them towards you and deals a bit of damage to them. But if you don't throw it at an NPC or a player just at a wall, it actually grapples you towards that wall, which can make this ability pretty useful for movement and literally turn you into Spider-Man. Next ability is the X ability, and this one is called Water Pulse. It has a 125 mastery requirement, and for this one you basically just create a blue shockwave dealing a bunch of damage to everything that surrounds you. Overall, this sword is good for beginners. It has really fast attacks compared to other swords in the first sea, and its M1 ability is one of the fastest out of every sword in the game. But overall, I wouldn't really recommend this sword for fighting people, but for grappling around and having fun, I definitely recommend this. It's probably one of the best swords in the game for that. Alright, next sword we got on the list is called the Pole. This is another legendary sword that we got here, and the way you get it is by defeating the Thunder God at Upper Sky, and you have a 5% chance of getting it dropped to you. This sword has a V2, which you can upgrade to for 10 radioactive rocks, 20 metal scraps, and 10 angel wings, and you get a 25% increase in damage. It has 2 different abilities, but starting off with the Z ability, which is called Explosive Cloud, and you basically just spawn in a cloud and you deal a huge electric explosion. And this ability has an 80 mastery requirement. Next ability is the X ability, and this one is called Lightning Rain, and it does exactly what it sounds like. It kind of just brings down lightning from the sky exactly where your cursor is and just deals a bunch of damage to your enemy. Overall, this ability has pretty mediocre stuns, decent damage, and low mastery requirements. But rubber users are completely immune to all the damage from the sword because they're all lightning based, and everyone knows that rubber users don't take any damage from lightning. So use this sword at your own risk. Moving on, we got the Saber sword, and this is yet another legendary sword on this list, and the NPC you get it from is someone called the Saber Expert. This sword also does have a V2, and in my opinion, the V2 of that sword is probably the best sword in the whole game because it's just really overpowered for bounty hunting. This sword also does have an upgraded version, which you can do for 5 radioactive rocks, 10 metal scraps, and 10 magma ore, and increases the sword's overall damage by 15%. But let's talk about the moveset for the V1 and the V2. Starting off with the V1, the first ability is called Deadly Rush, and this one has a 50 mastery requirement. And for this one, you kind of just dash forward in a red spiral, dealing a bunch of damage to any enemy in your way. Next ability is called Triple Slash, and it does exactly what it sounds like. You just shoot off 3 different slashes simultaneously, dealing a bunch of damage. Alright, let's move on to the V2 now. The ability names are exactly the same, it's just kind of the scale of the abilities that increases. The Deadly Rush has way more effects and deals way more damage to your enemies. And the Triple Slash ability actually isn't really a slash anymore. The slashes become so big that they actually just turn into a cluster of energy that you shoot at your enemy, and they deal way more damage and way more knockback. And the mastery requirements obviously stay the same. Overall, this sword is really good damage. Like I said before, it does the most damage out of any sword in the whole game. And it's crazy that they put the best sword in the game in the first seat, but I guess a lot of people aren't unlocking the V2 until later on. Moving on, the next sword we got on this list is called the Sadi, and this is another legendary sword, and the NPC you buy from is a person called the Legendary Sword Dealer, and you need to pay 2 million belly to get it. To upgrade this sword to grade 2, you need to pay the blacksmith 8 mystic droplets along with 10 leather, and it increases the sword's damage by 15%. So now let's talk about the skills of this sword. First one is called Sword Dance with a 150 mastery requirement, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You kind of just dance around with your sword, dealing damage to everything that's around you. Next ability is the X ability, and this one has a 300 mastery requirement. It's called True Air Slash. And this one is also exactly what it sounds like. You just shoot out a huge golden slash through the air, and if it hits anyone, it just deals a butt ton of damage to them. Overall, this sword is really good because it has good damage, good hitboxes, decent combos, and it's good for farming. But it does have pretty mediocre range, but then again, it doesn't really matter if you get close to your enemies. Overall, a really S tier sword. Next sword we got here is the Wandoo, and this is another legendary sword, and guess what, you buy this guy from the same NPC for the same amount of money of 2 million belly, and the upgrade costs are exactly the same, 8 mystic droplets along with 10 leather, and this increases the sword's damage by 15%. First ability is the Z ability, and this one is called continuous slashing with 150 master requirement, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You just keep slashing your enemies for several seconds and it deals a butt ton of damage to them. Next skill is called scatter shot, and this is the X ability with a 300 master requirement, and for this one you shoot 3 different air slashes, but they're more like air balls, if that makes sense, and it deals a bunch of damage to anything it hits. This sword has high damage and one of the best swords for grinding and PvP in the second C due to the amount of damage and long range moves it has. But then again, it is bad for PvP compared to some third C swords because the third C swords are actually crazy. But if you guys thought this sword was crazy, just wait till you hear the next one. Okay, so next up on the list, we got another legendary sword, and this one is called Shisui, and you buy it from the exact same NPC for the exact same amount of 2 million belly. To grade 2, it costs 8 mystic droplets along with 10 leather, and it increases the sword's damage by 10%. But now let's talk about the abilities. First ability is called True Quiet Rush, and this one has 150 master requirement. And this is similar to many other sword moves where you dash forward, dealing a butt ton of damage to any enemy that's in your way. Next ability is called Focus Shot, and this one has a 300 master requirement. And this is kind of like an air slash, but not really an air slash. It's more like an air bullet, and you just deal a butt ton of damage to anything this bullet hits. Overall, this sword is really good. Then again, it's a legendary, so I shouldn't really need to mention that. Has really good range, fast moves with no end lag, good combo potential, deals a decent amount of damage, and both of its moves can hit multiple targets, so it also makes it semi-useful for grinding. But it does have small hitboxes, so just make sure your aim is good, and then you should be able to master this sword. Alright, now we got the true triple katana, and this is the first mythical sword that we have on this list. And this is actually a combination of all the 3 swords from before, the Sadi, the Shisui, and the Wandoo. This sword you get from an NPC called the Mysterious Man by doing a long boring quest, and 2 million belly to buy. And to get this, you actually need all the swords from before, so in reality the cost of the true triple katana is actually 6 million belly. Damn, that is expensive. But it's definitely worth it. Just wait till you hear what this sword has to offer. To upgrade this sword to grade 2, you need to pay the blacksmith 5 dragon scales, 20 mystic droplets, and 50 leather, and it increases the sword's damage by 15%. The first ability of this sword is called the Wolf Fang Rush, and it has 150 master requirement. And for this one, you just dash forward and you create a huge ball around you, dealing damage to everything in your way. Next ability is called the Dragon Hurricane with a 350 master requirement, and for this one, you spawn in a huge tornado and you deal a bunch of damage to everyone that's caught in the tornado, and it sends your enemies flying away. Good things about this sword is that it's great for grinding. Both moves have little to no knockback, and it's really good for raids because of its huge hitboxes, and its M1 speed is highly above average. But the only bad thing about this sword I would say is how difficult it is to obtain, but if you do end up getting it, then it is amazing and literally one of the best swords in the whole game. So the next sword we got on the list is called the Long Sword. This is also a rare sword, and you can get it from a boss called the Diamond Boss with a 10% drop chance. And this boss is located at the Kingdom of Rose where the huge tree is. You can upgrade this sword to grade 2 by paying the blacksmith 10 radioactive materials, 10 metal, and increases damage by 25%. This sword has 2 abilities, and let's get into it. The Z ability is called Annihilate with 100 mastery requirement, and this ability is pretty good because it does a bunch of sword slashes to everything around you, but it has pretty short range and you can't really send a flying slash out to anyone, but it still has pretty good damage. Next ability is called Glorious Smash, and for this one you just smash your sword into the ground, dealing damage to everything around you. Overall, this sword has high combo potential and decent for farming because all of the moves have AoE damage, and it has relatively low mastery requirements for a second C sword. But the downside is that this sword has really close range and you can't really do damage to anything that's medium range or long range. But if you're fighting someone at close range, this is a really good sword. Alright, next sword we got here is called the Gravity Cade, and this is a rare sword, and you also get this one dropped from an NPC called Vegeta, but he only has a 3 to 5% chance of dropping it, so you're gonna have to grind this boss quite a few times to get it. You can upgrade the sword to grade 2 by paying him 3 meteorite ore along with 10 metal scraps, and increases the damage by 15%. So let's talk about the abilities now. First up, we got the Gravity Pull with the 125 master requirement, and for this one, exactly where you're aiming with your cursor, you'll actually just slam a bunch of gravity into there, dealing a bunch of damage and launching your enemy up into the sky. Next ability is called Meteor Barrage, and this is the X ability of the sword with a 250 mastery requirement. And for this one, it's actually similar to one of the abilities of the Gravity Fruit, and you spawn in a bunch of meteors dealing damage to everything around your cursor. Overall, this sword is pretty good because it has good damage, decent knockback, and both of its abilities can break observation. But it has a pretty small hitbox, and all of its skills are actually ground based, so you can't really do damage to anyone flying in the sky. But overall, I would still say it's a really solid sword, and in my opinion, it's pretty cool because it literally spawns in meteors. Next sword we got here is called Jite, and this is a rare sword, and you can also get this from an NPC called the Smoke Admiral, and with a 10% drop chance after defeating him. So now let's talk about its abilities. First, we got the Z ability with a 150 mastery requirement, and this one is called Smoke Barrage. And this is also similar to one of the Smoke Fruit's abilities, where you just shoot out a bunch of smoke pellets, dealing a bunch of damage to anything in its way. The next ability is the X ability, and this one is called Smoke Apparition. And for this one, you just deal a huge cloud of smoke all around your body in all directions of your user, dealing damage to literally everything that's around you. Overall, this sword is pretty good because it has high mobility and it can blind and stun your enemies, and it gives you an advantage in PvP even if it stuns them just for a bit. But the bad things are that its abilities are pretty hard to hit, you need really good aim, and it's not really good for sword mains. This is kind of just like a side sword that you want if you're a fruit main or something. Overall, still a pretty cool sword. Okay, so the next sword we got on this list is called Coco, and it is the first legendary sword that you get to see in the second sea. And the person you get it from is the Order boss, with a 10% drop chance. And the place you can fight this guy is during the Order boss raid. To upgrade the sword to its second grade, you need 10 tusks along with 50 metal pieces, and increases the sword's damage by 15%. So the first ability of this sword is called Electrical Stab with a 150 mastery requirement. And for this one, you kind of just dash forward with the blue trail, and you send anything in your way flying with a bunch of damage dealt to it. Next ability is called Injection Shot, and for this one you kind of just shoot a huge lightning fast projectile to wherever your cursor is. Overall, the sword has really great damage, very good for people that are hybrids between swords and fruits, especially for people with the control fruit. And it's good for combos and has really fast M1 clicks. But it has a really short stun duration, and it's really difficult to obtain, and pretty high mastery requirements. But overall, if you do get your hands on this sword, then do not let go of it. Alright, this next sword that we got here is actually pretty unique. It's a legendary sword, and it's called the Midnight Blade. And you don't actually buy this with money, nor do you get it from killing an NPC and getting it dropped to you. You buy it with a currency called Ectoplasm. And Ectoplasm is only available on the curse ship, and you also buy from an NPC on the curse ship called El Admin. And since this sword is a legendary sword, you already know it's going to be good. To upgrade this sword to grade 2, you need to pay the blacksmith 40 Ectoplasm along with 15 metal scraps, and increases the sword's damage by 15%. So let's start off with the first ability of this sword, Portal Opening, with a 150 mastery requirement. After this one, you just spawn in a portal where your cursor is, and you deal a butt ton of damage to any enemy standing there. Next ability is called Crescent Dash, and this is similar to many other swords on this list. You kind of just dash forward, leaving a huge trail of energy behind you, dealing a butt ton of damage to anybody that gets caught in it. Overall, this sword is really good because it has high damage, and it's good to use at close range, especially with the Buddha fruit. Has good stuns and good mobility, and some awesome combo potential. But the bad thing is that it has really small hitboxes, so you need really good aim to use it. But if you have the aim, then the sword should be very good in your hands. Okay, so the next sword we got on the list is the Ren Goku Sword, and this is another legendary sword. And the way you get this is actually pretty unique. Once you defeat the awakened Ice Admiral at the Ice Castle on the second sea, he has a chance of dropping something called a hidden key. And this hidden key actually lets you enter a secret room underneath the staircase, and once you walk in there, you should be able to open a chest with the key. And that's where you get the Ren Goku Sword. To upgrade this sword to its grade 2, you need 8 tusks, 20 magma ore, and 15 metal scraps, and increases the sword's damage by 8%. So let's talk about the moveset now. First up, we got the Z ability, and this one is called Demon Slayer with a 150 mastery requirement. For this one, you dash forward, dealing a bunch of damage to the user by locking them in place. And this is probably one of the best abilities in the whole game, and it definitely looks the coolest as well. Next ability is called Burning Slash, and for this one, you actually shoot an air slash, but unlike the normal air slashes, you actually leave a trail of fire behind it, and it deals a bunch of damage. Overall, this sword is super good because it has good combo potential, good knockback, useful in PvP, high damage, and both its skills are really good. But you do need to do a bit of grinding for it, because the hidden key from the awakened Ice Admiral has a pretty low drop chance. And both its abilities have decently high mastery requirements. Like, you literally need a 350 mastery on the sword if you want to use both its abilities. But in my opinion, it's worth it. Next up, we got not really a new sword, it's a sword from before, the Pole V2, and it's one of the best swords in the whole game. It's a legendary sword, and the way you get a V2 is by completing a long tedious quest, and if you want to do that, you can search it up. And to upgrade the sword to grade 2, you need to pay the blacksmith 15 fishtails, 10 mystic droplets, and 12 metal scraps. So let's get right onto the V2. The first ability is called Hand of God with 150 150 mastery requirement. For this one, you just shoot a bunch of lightning to exactly where your cursor is, and it deals a huge amount of damage and stuns your enemy for a slight amount of time. Next ability is the X ability. With a 350 mastery requirement, this one is called Electrical Prison. For this one, you just shoot out a huge ball of electricity and it traps your enemy, not letting them leave for a fixed period of time, and it deals a butt ton of damage to them. It has really high stun damage, and it can actually do damage to rubber users, unlike the V1 of this. And you do need to pay a hefty sum of 5,000 fragments to unlock this, but in my opinion, it's definitely worth it. And the first sword we got here is called the Dragon Trident. This sword you get from an NPC called the Tidekeeper, who has a 10% drop chance. And you can upgrade this sword with the blacksmith by paying him 10 dragon scales along with 10 leather, and it increases its damage by 10%. So the very first skill of this sword, the Z ability, has a 150 mastery requirement. For this one, you kind of just shoot out a huge water dragon, dealing a bunch of damage and knockback to your enemy. Next ability is the X ability, and this one has a 350 mastery requirement, and it's called Water Dragon Prison. And it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. You just spawn in a huge water prison around your enemy, not letting them escape and dealing a bunch of damage to them. This sword has really high damage with its skills, has really great combo potential, and a pretty big hitbox compared to other swords. But it has really high mastery requirements, and grinding the best boss in the second sea with only a 10% drop chance just to get the sword, in my opinion, isn't really worth it. But let's go to the next sword. The next sword we got here is called Yama. This is yet another legendary sword. And this sword is actually pretty similar to the one from before, and you'll find out why in a bit. Anyways, let's just talk about the skills themselves. First up, we got the Hellish Slash. And this is exactly what it sounds like. You just create a huge red and black slash and you send it flying towards where your cursor is. And it deals a butt ton of damage and knockback to anything that hits it. Next ability is called Infernal Hurricane with a 300 mastery requirement. For this one, you dash forward with a sideways hurricane behind you and you deal a butt ton of damage to the enemy. The sword has both good moves and mobility, and it's one of the best swords in the game for traveling. And on top of that, it has really good combo potential. But one bad thing I would say is that it has a little bit lower than average damage compared to swords in the third and second seed. But then again, it's a really good sword, so I recommend you guys to get it. Next sword we got here is called Tushina. This is yet another legendary sword, and the person you get it from is the Logma boss with a 100% drop chance. But let's talk a bit about the abilities of this sword. The first ability is called Heavenly Lunges with a 150 mastery requirement, and it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. You just shoot a butt ton of lunges towards your enemy and it does quite a bit of damage to them. Next ability is called Celestial Ravager with a 300 mastery requirement, and for this one you just dash towards your enemy with a butt ton of aura behind you and you send them flying, dealing a butt ton of damage to them. Overall, this sword has a pretty good moveset and very high combo potential in my opinion, and it's really easy to hit your attacks even without a stun. It's good for grinding and has great damage, but it's pretty hard to obtain just because of how tedious the quest to get it is. But overall, if you do end up getting it, it's a really good sword. So the next sword we got here is called the Dark Dagger, and I'm guessing a lot of you watching did not know what this sword was. This is another legendary sword, and the boss you get it from is actually Rip Indra, the raid boss, with a 2.5% drop chance. So first up we got the Z ability, and this one is called Proficient Impale. It has a 150 mastery requirement, and you just dash forward and you can just impale your enemy, dealing a butt ton of damage and knockback to them. Next ability is called Slamming Slash, and for this one you dash into their enemy and just striking them with your dagger multiple times. And this one is not really possible to dodge if you get caught in it. And therefore, this sword has really good combo potentials, a very low click cooldown, literally at 0.2 seconds, and it's almost impossible to escape the sword even with observation. Only downside I would say is that it's really hard to obtain. I mean, you literally have to kill the most powerful boss in the game, Rip Indra, and it only has a 2.5% drop chance. If you do end up getting this is a really good sword, or should I say dagger. Next sword we got here is called the Cavender. This is yet another legendary sword, and you get this from an NPC called the Beautiful Pyre with a 5% chance of getting it dropped. To upgrade the sword to grade 2, you need 6 dragon scales along with 20 leather, and increases the sword's damage by a total of 10%. First skill of this sword is called Piercing Dash, and this is basically just a copy paste of some other sword moves. You just dash forward, dealing a butt ton of damage to anything that's in your way. Next ability is called Scattering Gust, and this one has a 300 mastery requirement, and for this one you dash forward, dealing damage to everything that's behind and in front of you. Pretty unique ability if you ask me. Overall, this sword is great in PvP, pretty easy to aim with, and its moves can drain observation dodges. And both of its moves are mobility moves, so you can get around pretty quick with this. But one bad thing I would say is that this sword is pretty hard to grind with due to the dashes during the M1 attacks that occur with every single click, and that makes it pretty tedious for grinding. But if you just stick to PvP with the sword, then you should be fine. First sword we got in the third sea is called the Twin Hooks, and this is an uncommon sword, and you get it from an NPC called Captain Elephant with a 5% drop chance. To upgrade the sword to grade 2, you need 10 fishtails, 8 tusks, and 20 leather, and increases the sword's damage by 10%. This sword has 2 abilities. The first one is the Z ability, and this one is called Sky Cyclone with a 150 mastery requirement. It's exactly what it sounds like. It kind of just spawns in a cyclone from the sky, dealing a butt ton of damage to exactly where your cursor is pointed. Next ability is called Prehistoric Pun, and for this one you actually kind of grapple towards where your cursor is and you dash over there, dealing a butt ton of damage to anything in your way. And this ability has a 300 master requirement. Overall, a pretty mid sword for the 3rd C, but compared to the 1st C and 2nd C swords, this has really high damage. It also has a large hitbox, fast attack speed, and it's pretty good for combos. But other than that, I would just say it's pretty weak compared to the other swords from the 3rd C. But if you do get this, then you can use it for the time being. But just switch to a different sword if you get a better one. Next up, we got another mythical sword, and this one is called a Halo Scythe. And the way you get it is by defeating a boss called the Soul Reaper, and it has a 5% chance of dropping it. So the first ability of this scythe is called the Death Cyclone with a 150 master requirement. And for this one, you actually kind of shoot out a hellish looking tornado with black and orange effects. And it looks pretty cool. It's also really fast, which makes it pretty difficult to dodge. Next ability is called Soul Execution with a 350 master requirement. For this one, you actually dash forward with your sword, and unlike the other sword abilities, you can actually control where you go. And you can even change directions mid-dash. This sword is really good because it has a low cooldown, very little casting time with no startup. Literally, the abilities are instant. And it's really good for PvP because it can do high damage combos. But it's really difficult to get because you only have a 5% chance of getting it from the boss. And it's kind of hard to grind with. So if you do end up getting your hands on this sword, I only recommend it for PvP. Next sword we got on the list is the Buddy Sword, and this is another legendary sword, and you get this from the most troublesome NPC in the game, the Cake Queen, with a 5% drop chance. To upgrade this sword to its grade 2, you need 8 Coco Powder, 5 Mystic Droplets, along with 25 Leather, and it increases the sword's damage by 10%. First skill we got from this sword is called Heat Slash, with a 150 master requirement. And for this one, it just shoots a really fast air slash and deals a butt ton of damage to exactly where it lands, and also does burn damage. Next ability is called Lightning Wave, with a 300 master requirement, and it does exactly what it sounds like. Well, kinda. It actually kinda shoots out pink lightning, but it doesn't really matter. It still does a butt ton of damage. Overall, this sword is pretty good because it has a really fast click for its melee attacks. All its moves are very fast, making them incredibly hard to dodge, and it has excellent combo potential along with a high damage output. But the bad thing I would say is it doesn't really have any mobility moves, but it doesn't really matter because you're not using your swords to move, are you? You're just using them to dish out a butt ton of damage, and this sword does the trick. The next sword we got here is the Spiky Trident, and this is yet another legendary sword, and the NPC you get it from is the Cake Prince and the Dough King. You have a 5% chance of getting a drop from the Cake Prince and a 15% chance from the Dough King. And both of these bosses are actually pretty tedious to fight, so either way, it's going to be really difficult to get. So the first ability from this sword is called the Dough Hurricane with a 150 master requirement. And for this one, you charge towards your enemy, locking them in place, and you just keep impaling them with your trident, and it just deals a butt ton of damage to them. And one thing I should mention is that all of the moves from this sword actually are similar to the Dough Fruit, so this trident would work really well with it. Next ability is the X ability, and this one is called Flying Trident Pull, and it does exactly what it sounds like. If you hit an enemy with it, then it does a butt ton of damage and pulls them towards you. But if you don't hit an enemy, then you just kind of get a free grappling hook. Overall, this is really good for combo extending and stunning, and both moves are good for traveling. And it does really decent damage, and it's great for grinding bosses, but not really that good for grinding. But when it comes to one-on-ones, it's completely unmatched. Next up is the Cursed Dual Katana, and this is a mythical sword. And this is a combination of the Yama and Tushida, and the way you get it is by doing the Cursed Dual Katana puzzle. And this sword actually has 3 different abilities, and I'll explain how in a second. First ability is called Revolving Ravager, and this has a 175 master requirement. For this one, you just spawn in a huge ball of hellish energy and you shoot it to exactly where your cursor is. Next ability, or should I say abilities, is called Slayer of Goliath with a 375 master requirement. And the reason I said this sword has 3 different abilities is that this X ability actually has 2 different versions, depending on whether you're standing on the ground or you're off the ground. If you're standing on the ground, then you basically charge up an attack and dash forward towards your enemy. If you're actually midair, then it actually lets you charge up your ability a little bit more, and it deals way more damage than the normal version. Overall, both abilities are really good, and in my opinion, this might be the best sword in the whole game, if it weren't for a secret sword towards the end of this video. This sword has really great range, both attacks are multi-target, and really fast M1 clicks. But it's really hard to obtain just because you have to get 2 S tier swords and complete a long and tedious puzzle just to get it. But if you do get your hands on this, then you should be able to destroy any player that comes your way. And that's pretty much it for swords in the 3rd C, but there's 2 more secret swords that a lot of you might have not known existed. And this first one I think many of you should know, but the next one definitely not. So now we got the Dark Blade, and this is a mythical sword, and the way you get it is actually through a game pass in the game, and it costs a total of 1,200 Robux to buy. But there's actually 2 different ways of getting it without paying those Robux. One is by trading cheating, and the other way is by getting the Brazil cube and by fighting the Mihawk boss who has a 100% chance of dropping it. But that's not gonna happen because only an admin can spawn in the Brazil cube, and the chances of running into an admin are very, very low. So now let's talk about the abilities of this sword. First up, we got the 1000 slices, and for this one you just create a huge ball of slices and you deal a butt ton of damage to anything that's in front of you. And the next ability is called Dark Air Slash, and it does exactly what it sounds like. It just sends off a huge slash flying off into the sunset. It goes really far, and this one only has a 50 mastery requirement. Overall, this sword can be really good when it's paired with the Ice, Dark, and Rumble, and has really good combo potential along with really low mastery requirements for a mythical sword. But overall, I still think it's the worst mythical in the game because other mythical swords just outclass this one in every single way, except for mastery requirements. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter that much. Alright, now this is the secret sword that you've all been waiting for, the triple dark blade itself. And this is yet another mythical sword, and in secret this is actually probably the best sword in the whole game. But you're probably never gonna get it in your lifetime. And the reason for that is that the only people that get this are admins, or people that are really close friends with one. And keep in mind, do not beg for this sword because an admin will definitely not drop it to you then. And even then, your chances of meeting an admin in-game are really close to 0. But if you do end up being lucky enough to get this sword, then you should use it to its full potential. The first ability is called 1000 slices, and this has a 1 mastery requirement, and this is exactly the same ability as the normal dark blade, but just wait till the next one. The next ability is the X ability, and it's called Dark Air Slash, and it has a 50 mastery requirement just like the normal dark blade. But instead of shooting out just 1 dark air slash, the triple dark blade shoots out 3 different air slashes, and if someone is right in front of you, it deals 3 times the damage of the normal dark blade when all of these slashes just run into their face. I'm pretty sure that's an insta kill, but I'm not really sure because I don't really have this sword and I can't test it. Overall, this is the best sword in the whole of Blox Fruits, but you're probably never gonna get your hands on it.